Today, the Defense Department's top two leaders going to battle with Republican senators over the U.S. response in Benghazi.
There was no specific intelligence or indications of an imminent attack on the U.S. facilities in Benghazi. And frankly, without an adequate warning, there was not enough time, given the speed of the attack, for armed military assets to respond. The United States military, as I've said, is not and frankly should not be a 911 service capable of arriving on the scene within minutes to every possible contingency around the world.
Did you ever get the message that said they could not withstand a sustained attack on the consulate?
I was tracking that intelligence. I was tracking through General
Did you receive that information?
I did, and I saw it.
So it didn't bother you?
It bothered me a great deal, but
why
we never
didn't you
received
put forces in place to be ready to respond?
Because we never received a request to do so, number one, and number two,
you never heard of Ambassador Stevens' repeated warnings about the lack of security?
I had through General Ham, but we never received a request for support from the State Department, which would have allowed us to put forces
on the ground. So it's the State Department's fault.
I'm not blaming the State Department. I'm sure they had their own assessment.
Would you blame?
Is there a saying in the military, when you go into harm's way, we've got your back?
Of course, yes, sir.
Don't you think that saying has been undermined here? That how can people in the military, the Foreign Service, believe we've got their back when after over did you know how long the attack was going to last, Secretary Panetta?
No idea.
Well, it could have lasted for 2 days.
We spoke with Senator McCain shortly after the hearing. Nice to see you, sir.
Thank you, Greta.
I realize today was a hearing with the Secretary of Defense and General Dempsey. I'm curious, though, do you know what the CIA was doing at that Benghazi consulate? What was their job?
I do not know what their job was, and I'm sure it was gathering intelligence.
The reason that I asked about the question about what was the CIA doing is because one of the other issues that came up is arming of the Syrian rebels, a question that came up, and there's been a long controversy as to whether or not the United States was going to arm the Syrian rebels or not, and who was on board and who wasn't on board. And there's been some suggestion that that through that consulate, at least some of our reporting at Fox, is that weapons were being sent to Turkey to the Syrians. And I'm curious whether or not that consulate was being used to channel weapons to the Syrian rebels, for one, and number two, what do you think about the response from General Dempsey and Secretary Panetta about weapons to Syrian rebels?
Well, there were published reports that some of the arms were coming from Libya that were arriving for the resistance in Syria. But that information that we had was not through the United States government, but through other sources. But I'm not clear on that. But the thing that's really astounding to me is that we had a hearing with Secretary Panetta and General Dempsey back in March a year ago, and at that time some 7,000 Syrians had been killed. They both said at the time, Bashar Assad will fall inevitably. We're now up to over 60,000 who have been massacred, hundreds of thousands in refugee camps, a million displaced. I mean, the numbers are staggering. And we now have found out, as a result of this hearing, that both Secretary Panetta and General Dempsey supported sending arms to the Syrian resistance. How did we find that out? Because there was a New York Times story that revealed last week that both Secretary Clinton and General Petraeus, then head of the CIA, had also advocated sending arms to the rebels in the resistance in Syria. So now we have a situation where the entire national security team, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, head of CIA, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who all advocated sending weapons to these rebels so they could defend themselves, keeping in mind the Russians are supplying Assad, as is Iranians, including Iranian Revolutionary Guard on the ground.